This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage was gutted by fire tonight and is being called suspicious.
Picture the setup. People expect a padlocked warehouse somewhere off a Florida back road. Government agents in unmarked cars. Blueprints stamped classified by a sport too scared to let the public see them. That's the version of Smokey Yunick's garage that lives in comment sections and forum threads. It's a great story. It's also almost nothing like what actually happened when the doors finally swung open. The truth is stranger, messier, and in some ways more impressive than the legend because nobody had to break in. They just had to show up with cash. Smokey Yunick died on May 9, 2001. He was 77 years old, and leukemia had been working on him for about a year before it finally won. He passed at his home in Daytona Beach, the same city where he'd spent decades building a reputation as the most inventive and most investigated mechanic in American racing. By the time he died, the workshop that made him famous had already been quiet for years. He'd opened it back in 1947 and run it continuously until 1987, when he closed the doors for good. His stated reason was blunt, almost dismissive. He said there weren't any good mechanics left worth keeping the place open for. For over a decade after that, the building sat mostly untouched, a time capsule nobody had gotten around to opening. That changed the year after his death. Instead of a private auction for collectors or a museum acquisition team quietly cataloging inventory, Smokey's widow, Marge Yunick, threw the doors open to the public during Speed Weeks in February 2002. It wasn't quiet. People drove in from Maine. People flew in from Oregon. They came because this wasn't just any garage. It was the building Smokey himself had nicknamed the best damn garage in town, and everybody wanted a piece of it before it was gone. What they found inside wasn't a laboratory guarding secrets. It was a workshop that looked exactly like what it was, the physical residue of 50 years of stubborn, restless tinkering. $5 fender hammers sat in bins a few feet from $20 boxes, stuffed with genuine race car components. There were towers of old hubcaps, piles of exhaust pipe, a vintage GMC dealership sign from the 1950s still intact, even Smokey's own manual typewriter, the one he'd pounded out decades of notes, letters, and complaints on, was up for grabs. And then, sitting almost casually among the ordinary junk, was one hand-built engine with a price tag of $20,000 and a claim attached to it that sounded almost like a joke: 80 miles per gallon. Marge had a line that summed up the whole scene better than any reporter could have. She told people, "We're like a junkyard, but a first-class junkyard." It wasn't false modesty. It was accurate. And she made it clear this was exactly how Smokey would have wanted it handled. He had no interest in his life's work getting roped off behind museum glass, admired from a distance by people who'd never turn a wrench. He wanted his tools back in calloused hands. He wanted the parts back on cars. He wanted people who loved this stuff the way he did to walk away owning a piece of it. That instinct tracked with who he'd always been. Smokey spent much of his career rescuing machines other people had given up on and coaxing them back to life. According to his family, the idea of his legacy being locked away for wealthy collectors to admire from behind velvet rope would have insulted him. So instead, the money raised from selling off his workshop went toward funding a foundation built to support new innovation in motorsports, a fitting continuation of a career spent constantly pushing rules and machines past where anyone expected them to go. His daughter, Trish Yunick Brown, admitted that while fans lined up for the physical objects, she was holding on to something she considered far more valuable: his stories. Her husband, Chris Brown, had a description of Smokey that racing fans instantly recognized and appreciated. He called him NASCAR's wildest cheater. It wasn't an insult wrapped in affection. It was closer to a professional compliment. Smokey had built his entire career finding legal gray zones nobody else had noticed, forcing officials to rewrite rulebooks in response to what he'd already built. That contrast is really the whole story in miniature. Instead of a secret seizure by federal agents or a midnight NASCAR raid sweeping through in the dead of night, the actual great reveal was a garage sale where regular fans could pick up an ordinary hammer with one hand and an engine that outperformed anything Detroit was building with the other. The building itself didn't survive much longer. The property sold in 2003, and the last standing structure burned down in a fire on April 25, 2011. But by then, none of that mattered. The real inheritance, the tools, the engines, the ideas had already scattered into garages and private collections across the country, doing exactly what Smokey wanted them to do. Would you have made that drive across state lines for a $5 hammer that once belonged to him? Or would you have held out saving up for a shot at that impossible 80-mile-per-gallon engine? Because here's the thing, mixed in with the ordinary clutter were pieces of hardware that weren't leftovers at all. They were prototypes. Machines that Detroit's own engineers had tested, verified, and then walked away from anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether they actually worked. The crown jewel of that collection, and the piece of technology most closely tied to Smokey's name today, is what's known as the hot vapor engine. Modern engines lean on computers to manage fuel delivery with split-second precision. Smokey didn't have that luxury, and honestly, he didn't want it. His approach started with a modified 2.5-liter Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke 4-cylinder A. Stock, unremarkable engine that in factory form produced around 90 horsepower and returned roughly 35 miles per gallon on the highway. Nothing special. The kind of engine nobody would look at twice. Smokey's carbureted version of that same block put out 250 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque. It dropped the 0 to 60 time down to roughly 6.5 seconds, and somehow, despite all that added power, it still delivered 51 miles per gallon running on 93-octane pump gas. Those numbers shouldn't coexist. More power and dramatically better fuel economy from the same basic engine block isn't how internal combustion is supposed to work. More power almost always means burning more fuel, not less. So how did he pull it off? The technical term is adiabatic combustion, but the plain language version is easier to picture. Instead of cooling the air-fuel mixture the way every conventional engine does, Smokey did the opposite. He used waste heat from the exhaust and coolant systems to actually boil the mixture before it reached the cylinders. That superheated mixture got pushed through an exhaust-driven turbine, something Smokey called a homogenizer, mounted underneath the carburetor. It ran through a specially wrapped intake manifold until temperatures climbed past 450 degrees Fahrenheit. The result was a fuel mixture that vaporized completely, allowing the engine to run at an extremely lean air-to-fuel ratio, leaner than 20 to 1, well beyond what a normal engine could tolerate without stumbling or stalling. And crucially, this wasn't just a claim Smokey made about his own workshop project. Detroit's own labs and OEM engineers independently verified those performance numbers, confirming the engine met strict 1980s emissions requirements without any computer managing it at all. This wasn't a solo invention either. The core concept traced back to the 1950s and a man named Ralph Johnson, a Holley carburetor specialist and General Motors dyno technician who partnered with Smokey on the early research. Together, they figured out how to push combustion past the normal detonation threshold, running exhaust temperatures near 2,250 degrees to keep the hydrogen burn under control. Johnson had a line about their lean burn tuning that captured the tightrope they were walking. The engine ran its absolute best right before it was about to destroy itself. They didn't stop at one test mule. Over the years, the pair built several hot vapor prototypes, a 3-cylinder Buick, a modified Ford, and a Dodge Omni among them. Every single one of those test vehicles exceeded 45 miles per gallon while producing nearly 2 horsepower per cubic inch, numbers that would be respectable even decades later. There were real, serious attempts to bring the technology to market too. This wasn't just garage tinkering that never left Daytona Beach. There was a near-miss production deal involving a Chevy S10 truck and a licensing agreement with Crane Cams that could have put the technology into far more hands. Ultimately, though, the whole effort collapsed under a familiar combination of problems: unresolved durability concerns, mounting legal fees, high manufacturing costs, and a deeply ingrained not-invented-here attitude from an auto industry that didn't love being shown up by an independent garage in Florida. But the physical engine survived, and that's what makes this part of the story different from most lost technology tales. There's actual hardware you can go look at. Smokey's daughter Trish kept 4 of the original prototypes. Enthusiast Tony Allers eventually acquired the running examples, and using the salvaged original drivetrain, built a faithful, daily-driven Fiero replica around it, and then actually drove it, for years, as a regular car. On Christmas Day in 2009, Allers donated that vehicle to the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing, where it remains on public display. Another unit is reportedly held by the Smithsonian. Sit with that for a second. A carbureted 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, built in a garage in Florida, hit 250 horsepower and 51 miles per gallon in the 1980s while meeting the emission standards of the era, and Detroit let it die. Because nobody wanted to admit an outsider had solved a problem their own engineering departments hadn't cracked. The hot vapor engines are the physical proof, the machines you can walk up to and touch in a museum. But Smokey didn't stop at building hardware. He filed patents, real legally documented ideas, covering fuel conditioning systems, oil systems, engine testing methodology, and even racetrack safety barriers. Every one of those documents is a permanent record of an idea the racing world dismissed, only to quietly circle back and adopt years or decades later. Patents matter here because they're essentially legal timestamps, official proof of exactly when an idea existed and who claimed it first. United States Patent and Trademark Office records confirm Smokey held at least 9 patents filed between 1978 and 1996. Taken together, they paint a picture of a man who wasn't just experimenting for fun. He was systematically trying to solve problems the industry either hadn't noticed yet or didn't want to deal with. A cluster of those patents came directly from the hot vapor research filed between 1984 and 1988. They cover the specific mechanical apparatus, the operating methods, and the fuel conditioning systems that powered the Fiero prototype. Those patents entered the public domain around 2003, meaning the underlying technology is now freely available for any engineer curious enough to study it. Beyond the hot vapor cluster, there's patent 4,068,635, covering a pressure vent design filed in 1978. Patent 5,246,086 covers an oil change system filed in 1991. And patent 5,515,712 covers a method for engine testing filed in 1994. Each one represents a different corner of the automotive world Smokey decided needed fixing, whether anyone had asked him to fix it or not. But some of his most contentious battles with sanctioning bodies weren't about engines at all. They were about safety and aerodynamics, 2 areas where Smokey was consistently years, sometimes decades, ahead of the officials governing his sport. In 1961, he developed pneumatic air jacks designed to lift a stock car instantly during pit stops, shaving precious seconds off every service. NASCAR rejected them outright, ruling them inappropriate for the series. The following year, he mounted a massive wing over the engine of Jim Rathman's Simonized Special, a Watson Roadster entered in the Indy 500. That wing generated serious downforce and dramatically improved cornering speed. It also created enough straightaway drag that the United States Auto Club banned it almost immediately. Decades later, of course, wings became not just accepted, but mandatory equipment across Can-Am, Formula One, and IndyCar. Smokey had simply arrived at the idea before anyone was ready to let him use it. The most painful delay of all, though, involves safety barriers, and it's the one part of his story that carries real human weight. In the early 1980s, long before anything like the modern safer barrier existed, Smokey designed a primitive soft wall concept, old tires, sandwiched between heavy sheets of plywood, meant to absorb impact energy in a crash, rather than reflecting it straight back into the driver. NASCAR didn't adopt it. Drivers kept racing against solid concrete for years afterward. Smokey eventually formalized that research into patent 5,645,368, filed in 1996, specifically describing a racetrack design incorporating a novel crash barrier. It's a fair question to sit with how many injuries, or worse, might have been prevented if NASCAR had taken Smokey's tire wall concept seriously in the early 1980s, instead of waiting until the 2000s to develop safer barriers through a completely separate, much later research effort. The patents and the rejected safety proposals reveal a consistent pattern. Smokey kept solving problems before the sport's rulebook, or its officials, were willing to admit those problems existed. And nowhere is that pattern more visible or more famous than in the car that finally forced NASCAR to invent a completely new inspection process. There's a photo of Smokey that still circulates constantly online, leaning against a Chevelle, crooked grin, cigar in hand. It usually gets captioned as the 7/8 scale car that made NASCAR rewrite the rules. That caption sounds great. It's also almost entirely wrong, and the actual measurements prove it. A genuine 7/8 scale replica of a stock Chevelle would have been nearly 10 inches narrower than the real thing, more than 2 feet shorter overall, and built on a 100-inch wheelbase instead of the standard length. A car built to those dimensions wouldn't have been a subtle trick. It would have been blatantly obviously smaller to anyone who walked past it in the garage. Nobody would have needed a tape measure to catch it. What actually happened was far more subtle and honestly more impressive from an engineering standpoint. The real story involves 3 1966 bodied Chevelles, frequently misidentified online as 1967 models that started with legitimate development work already done by Chevrolet's own engineering division, and then received a round of meticulous finishing touches from Smokey himself. The modifications weren't about shrinking the car. They were about reshaping how air moved across it. Smokey shifted the entire body about 2 inches backward on the chassis, improving the car's weight distribution. He smoothed and subtly raised the floor pan to better manage airflow underneath the vehicle, a detail most inspectors would never think to check. He lowered the roofline and window openings just slightly, raked the windshield back a few more degrees than stock, and reworked the fenders and drip rails. He even modified the front bumper, sectioning it to sit taller and effectively function as an aerodynamic spoiler. Nothing about the sheet metal itself was dramatically different. It still looked, at a casual glance, like an ordinary Chevelle, but the underlying geometry had been sculpted, inch by inch, to cut through the air more efficiently. At speeds above 180 miles per hour, differences that small stop being cosmetic and start being decisive. When NASCAR inspectors finally sensed something wasn't matching up, they scrambled to build their first ever inspection templates and ironically used a wrecked Chevelle driven by Bobby Johns as their reference pattern, not realizing how much variance already existed even among stock cars. The resulting confusion during inspection was serious enough that NASCAR ultimately mandated standardized roof, hood, and trunk templates across the entire field, a practice that continues in modified form to this day. And the engineering behind it wasn't just clever on paper, it worked on the track. Driving one of these modified Chevelles, Curtis Turner became the first driver in history to qualify at over 180 miles per hour at Daytona. Smokey himself pushed back directly against the scale model myth, both in a 1987 Circle Track magazine interview and later in his own autobiography, explaining in detail that his changes were far more calculated and far less crude than a simple shrink-ray story implies.